Hi everybody, Steve here, and let's talk through a really great adaptation and really great comic, which is Ghost World. And today I really want to talk through the form of adaptation and what's actually going on with the form. When we often talk about, say, prose to visuals, we don't really concentrate too much on the form because the forms are so different. One is words on a piece of paper, the other goes into exchanges into moving pictures. But with the comic is very similar to the film, where it's a story being told through often exchange of dialogue and exchange of images, where the images are being given you, the images are sort of set up to give you little pieces of information. And if you actually just look at the comic strip, it's very similar to, say, the film strip. Even the way that a film was storyboarded, where it's kind of broken down to a series of shots and images. That's very much how the comic book is set up. So it's very easy to make comparisons to the comic book adaptation as opposed to the the film adaptation, just through what it's actually doing. And if you read the Ghost World that I've given you for this week's reading, you will see that it's almost shot by shot in the way that it's actually being shot, and just the dialogue doesn't change at all either. So what you've actually got is a very literal adaptation, and the comic book adaptation can be far more literal than any other form of adaptation. You don't actually have to make those many changes to it, which is really interesting, and it's something that I want to talk through today. So if you just think of, so here is where the wild things are, and this is the thing about the comic book. In the children's picture book or any other form of writing, really, you've got this narrator, you've got this voice of God narrator, right? And the voice of God narrator is giving you external information that's important for your understanding of the film, right? So if you look at this image from Where the Wild Things Are, you've got the narrator saying, and made him king of all the wild things, right? So we're told that Max is being made king of all the wild things. But in Ghost World, in the comic, we don't have that narrator, right? What we have is information given to us through the visuals, information given to us through the characters and through their exchange of dialogue, right? And that's the case, and that's the difference between, so, the picture book adaptation and the comic book adaptation. And it's why in a film it is far more like the comic strip than, say, anything else. Think of all the things that Spike Jonze had to add um, to Where the Wild Things Are, right? We don't actually have to make those many adjustments or those many changes to the comic strip. And I think that's really interesting. And it's a way that we can actually directly compare an adaptation, which has always been the case. How do we assess adaptation? Because you can't, it's very hard to assess adaptation because of the forms, and the forms are so different. But here we've got forms that are very, very similar. Now, this is very much a celebration, this adaptation. So Daniel Clowes, who is the comic strip writer, and Terry Zwigoff, who he is the director. So basically, they co-wrote the screenplay together. Now, I'm kind of interested in what you think about this. When we were talking about, say, James Franco being involved in Palo Alto, it became very difficult for Gia Coppola to actually make any significant changes to the text, right? Because she's got the guy who wrote the text kind of in the film, right? He hired her into the film. So I suppose the question is, yes, it's celebration, but is it too limiting that you've actually got the comic strip writer there, or is it actually a good thing? A lot of adaptations actually use the writer of the original in the adaptation. I suppose because they don't want to get it wrong. David Fincher, he's a big fan of doing this. But it's just kind of interesting that, yes, it's celebration, but is that actually creating some problems? Okay, how do we know what sort of adaptation this is? And again, it comes back to the whole idea of a celebration adaptation. It's edgy, it's raw, it's rough, like the comic. It's about loners and isolation, like the comic. You know, these themes are nicely suited to the myth of a comic book reader, and I think that's what's really interesting about this adaptation, or so just Ghost World more generally. It's about the comic book reader, people who actually read comic books, and we've actually got scenes where people are in the comic book stores. it's not about the superhero comic book character, right? And that's it's very different, but it's also very interesting. Enid, who is the central protagonist here, she's also a comic drawer, right? And she's really interested in comics. She's interested in reading comics and writing comics. Now, there are several references to other comic strips written also by Daniel Clowes. So if any of you know Daniel Clowes, you'll probably be seeing all these references across the film of his other work, which is, again, it's a celebration. It's really celebrating all of the things he's been doing. So you've actually got there's a coffee shop patron in a wheelchair, right? And this is actually from a Clowes strip called Feldman and the called Feldman. And there's another gag, which is actually a scene when Enid's at art school, and it's called Tampon and Teacup. It's a gag that we see. Again, that's actually drawn directly from his comic strip, which this one was called Art School Confidential, which would become another film adaptation between these two creative forces. So it's just kind of interesting the way that celebration is actually, it sort of plays itself out in this film, and the film is very much trying to attract the fans of the comic to the film. And I suppose the question is, does it actually work? If you're a comic fan, I'm interested to know what you think of this adaptation. Okay, so the main difference to, say, Ghostworld when we're talking about comic book adaptations is it's an adjustment, but it's an adjustment to form, and we don't actually talk about adjustment to form when we're talking about adaptation because the forms are so different. What's even the point of even mentioning them? But here, there is an adjustment to the form. Now, if you think of other comic book adaptations, like an X-Men, like a Dick Tracy, like a Sin City, this is an image from Sin City. What's actually going on here is they're trying to do everything they can to take the visual image from the comic and put that on the screen. Now, people have really gone against this sort of form of comic book adaptations. They call it insulting to the comic art form, right, of what they're actually trying to do. Because you actually look at a film like Sin City is a really good example. It just looks wrong. The way it's actually being, the way they've put a comic idea onto the screen, it looks really artificial, it looks really fake, and it looks really false. And it's really hard to invest in the characters and the story when constantly on the screen we're being told this actually isn't real, because how could it be real? Because it seems just so far-fetched. Where what you've got in Ghostworld, right, is it's gone for a real-world aesthetic, right? It's not going. It doesn't look cartoonish. Now, there was a bit of criticism around the film at the time because the comic strip was actually tinged in blue, which I'll show you in a second. But for the most part, this is it's an indie film, it's a cheap film, it's a film that actually the film goer can look at this film and think, oh yeah, I can actually see myself in this world, because this world is a very real and a very relatable world. Okay, so this is the black and white with a hint of pale blue tinge that sort of works across the Ghostworld comic. Now, in the copy that I've given you, you won't actually see the blue tinge because, of course, when they copy things, they do it with black and white, so you don't actually see the blue. But the blue is kind of interesting, the way it sort of plays across all of the comics here. You don't actually have that blue, and at the time, a lot of people criticised that because for them, Ghostworld is this blue tinge, and they wanted to see that, and of course, they're not seeing that. But anyway, I'll leave that point there. Okay, now the film is very much a pastiche, but what I mean by this is it's not. So when we talk about pastiche and parody are kind of spoken together, right? And pastiche is the more serious way of thinking of an earlier work or an earlier time or something like that, right? Now, what I mean by pastiche in this instance is it's a pastiche of the performances. And what I mean by that is it's a respect to the performances. Sorry, it's a respect to the comic strip. So what the performances are trying to do is say, okay, we are going to try and get inside the characters from the comic, and we're going to try and push them into the film. So they're kind of doing it within in a style that is pastiche, right? So performances are not pushed too far like many comic book adaptations. Many comic book adaptations actually goes to the point of parody. And you could look at Sin City and you could look at the performances in a film like that and think, it's actually parody what's going on here. It's not really pastiche. There's a far more investment and engagement and seriousness of the way that these actors are actually performing these characters, right? Its characters are real people, and you really get a sense of that. Its characters look ordinary. You don't often have that in a comic book adaptation. Thora Birch actually gained 20 pounds for the role of Enid, you know, because she really just wanted to make herself look very ordinary. Look at the way she carries herself in the film, the way she stands, the way she walks, the way she moves. All right, she's really going for that ordinary, everyday kind of person. Also, we care about these characters. We care about Enid. We care about Seymour very much. And you can actually say perhaps even more than we do in the comic. So it's pastiche, but it's also parody. With parody, now, often when we talk about parody and adaptation, what we're actually talking about are kind of those, the remakes where you take one work and like the Naked Gun films and things like that, where you're just basically parodying earlier works and you're laughing at it. But parody here, you're not laughing at the comic. You're not saying, oh, look how stupid this comic was and let's just make fun of it. I think you're laughing with the comic. And that's very different. So there's a lot of laughs going on here. There's a lot of laughs about the comic book world. Like you'll actually see them. They'll go, to comic book stores and stuff, and they kind of just mock the comic book reader as nerds and things like that. All right, but there's a lot of humour across the film, which some of it was actually inserted into the film that isn't in the comic. Like Swigoff actually unintentionally cast the actor who played the high school principal as a customer in the pawn shop, which you didn't even realise you'd done at the time. But there's a lot of humour. There's some great slapstick moments. There's some witty one-liners. It's a very, very funny, humorous film, and it's about parodying really this world that we're in, with Ghost World being like a ghost town. Okay, revision. There is a lot of changes that were made to the film. The thing about the film is there's far more kind of nothing to do, and there's no culture, and that's what the film really is about. It's about culture, right? So it's about Enid learning about this history of music. It's about art. It's about trying to create things that aren't already there. It's a deep engagement through music and through listening to music, right? Now in the comic, the character of Seymour, who's played by Steve Buscemi, he appears only as a victim of the girl's prank. But in the film, he's far more fleshed out. He's a far more interesting and engaging character. And he has this whole history of understanding of the history of blues music. And he becomes really, really interesting for us as watchers, and we're really invested in him. Also in the film, Rebecca had a rather diminished role. So Rebecca is played by Scarlett Johansson. I guess if they knew the star and the celebrity that Scarlett Johansson would go on to be, they might have just beefed up her role a bit more than they have. The interesting thing about Rebecca in the film is in the comic, Rebecca and Enid are kind of inseparable, right? They're just two inseparable chums, where you don't actually have that in the film. You actually have, it's really Enid's story, and Rebecca is kind of there as a foil almost. Right, so it is illusion. So film itself alludes to other things. There's some original movie posters on Enid's walls, which are about two teenage girls with similarities to this film, okay? So it's actually trying to say, this is the context we want this film to be placed in. We want it to be placed in films about other girls who are discontent with the world, right? There's also that allusion to the history of blues music and the history of music, with the song Devil Got My Woman sort of played throughout and sort of discussed throughout. Just another point is that Lisa Simpson from The Simpsons is actually a really big Ghost World fan, and you see her across many, many episodes making references to Ghost World. Now, I know that's not an allusion in the film Ghost World, but you can just sort of think how in something like The Simpsons that Ghost World is actually being referenced as a way for its audience to understand that world that Lisa kind of sees herself in. And if you think about it, Lisa could easily be in Ghost World. She could easily be the character in Ghost World, and she could easily be sitting with Enid and Rebecca at the coffee shop, just kind of making fun of the world around them and just how ridiculous the world is. It's very much colonization. So Terry Zwigoff, the director, this is very much a film like his other films. He made another film, another adaptation with Daniel Clowes, which came afterwards, which is called Art School Confidential, which is an absolute dog's breakfast of a movie. It's a terrible film. It's a disastrous film. It kind of killed Zwigoff's career. But the thing about Zwigoff is he's really interested in comics, and he's really interested in comic book adaptations. So that is Art School Confidential, is a Clowes adaptation strip that they adapted. He did Crumb, that was his first film, which is a documentary on the famous cartoonist Crumb, and actually some of his images do appear in the film. Crumb's wife, so for Enid's illustrations that she draws in the film, were actually drawn by Crumb's wife? I think it was Crumb's wife, where Zwigoff insisted that a female be drawing the images that Enid was actually composing in that. Like all of his films, this one is about misfits, about anti-heroes. It's got the theme of alienation that sort of carries across the film. And also the character of Seymour, Steve Buscemi's character, is actually based on in part on Zwigoff. Like Seymour, Zwigoff is an avid collector of the 1920s jazz and blues records. And I think that really comes through really well in the film, that you really get a sense of Seymour because he's given so much depth and interest through his own obsessions. Okay, so just some things to take away. It's visual to visual is too often overlooked as adaptation, okay? And I just want to talk about how is this being adapted? What's actually going on in this adaptation? And let's actually talk about how we can think how this is being adapted from one form to another in ways that we often can't. Because here we have basically the comic strip, and then the film actually plays out pretty much shot for shot as it appears in the comic. And I think that's really interesting. But then, is the comic too limiting because of that? Can we actually go places with it that that other forms actually allow us to? Like when you think about where the wild things are, it's actually saying through the adaptation, you're going to have to make up some stuff here, right? Where the comic strip isn't so much like that, which I think is really interesting. What happens when a creator of the source adapts? And let's talk through that whole idea. I mean, we spoke about James Franco being involved in his adaptations, but I want to talk directly about basically the writer of the source actually being there in the adaptation. Is that a good thing or is that a negative thing? What are the positives and negatives there? And also, comic adaptation is about performance, right? It's about performance. And think about how the actors are performing these comic characters and what they're actually doing with the comic characters in a way that I think is very interesting, very grounded. Okay, I'll leave it there. I think Ghost World's a really terrific film. It's really funny. It's got three fantastic performances really by Thora Birch, Scarlett Johansson, and Steve Buscemi. It's a really, really cool film, and I hope you get something out of it, and I hope you got something out of this, and I look forward to seeing you around. Bye for now.